Thank you for joining the Salty Witches podcast. Thank you for joining on YouTube as well, and for all of our listeners who listen on Spotify, Audible, and all the other major streaming services. I'm your host, Austin, and of course, we have your second host, or second in command.
I'm Mike.
Michael.
Should we keep referring to ourselves as hosts? It seems weird. Like a host is like... A host seems appropriate when we have a guest on. But like, are we... Is it still applicable?
We're your witchy gunkles.
Okay. Hello, our little saltines.
We're the
back.
Ritz to your saltines.
We're back with another... Ooh, are you putting on the Ritz? That seems expensive and a lot of work. No, thank you. Tonight we are discussing deity work.
As you can see.
Statues. We've talked about deity work on the podcast before, but it seems to be... Deity work is, for me, kind of like a catch-22 in the context of witchcraft and alternative spiritual practices. But it is very much a trending thing, like consistently trending thing.
Well, why do you think that is?
Well, this is where I mentioned a moment ago that for me it's a catch-22 because on the one hand, I can absolutely see the value in being able to connect to something that we would identify as like, you know, like that kind of divinity, right? Or that kind of that power, right? Or even maybe, you know, I was talking with Ashley earlier, maybe it isn't even a theistic thing, right? Maybe it's just an appreciation for the beauty of the archetype of said deity, right? Or the influence that they hold, right? In whatever sense. But for me, it's a tricky thing too, because it also very often seems to be a carryover or a holdover from a lot of the old religious stuff that people bring with them into paganism and witchcraft.
Yeah, that's one thing that I have observed when it comes to deity work is a lot of, specifically witches, automatically jump to, well, I need to find a god, I need to find a goddess, or I need to work with these deities. And no, you don't. Historically, witches didn't really necessarily work with deities. It's not that witches didn't believe in deities. As a matter of fact, historically, witches would have worked with more primal sources of spirit. I mean, even in Cornish witchcraft, you have spirits like the Buka, the Bukadu or the Bukagudir, and they're not necessarily gods.
But the Buka is a good example, though, because I was going to say, in the context of, like, if you look at historically, right, we know that many of the pagan gods that people work with in more modern practice, right, witchcraft, you know, pagan, whatever it is, alternative spiritualities, right, we know that a lot of those are spirits that have, many of them I think have, they're designated, they're identified as deities now, right, because of the context that we have of what deity is, that once again really primarily comes from religion, right? But yes, like if you were to take those practices, like you mentioned, like Cornish or Anglo kinds of witchcraft traditions, folk magic traditions, right, and a spirit like the Buka to an English witch 200 years ago would never have been considered a god. Not in the way that we think of gods now. Yeah, like the Buka was a primordial spirit connected to the land, you know,
connected to the people,
connected to the faith folk, you know, like there, but never necessarily deity or god in the context of, say, like more Abrahamic faith.
Yeah,
right.
That's one thing that I find really interesting when it comes to deity work, and how it's being perceived today. Is you have two types of people that I've noticed with deity work. You have the individuals who take it extremely seriously, where they're doing their research, they're doing the stuff to focus on the historical context of the deity within the mythos of the cultures that that deity is from. You know, obviously we have statues up here of like Hecate, Nyx, Horus, Thoth, Diana, Morrigan. So we have all these deities up here, and a lot of people are doing historical research into it.
You forgot Gaia.
And Gaia. Who else did I forget? Diana.
No, you said Diana.
I said Diana. Oh, I forgot Gaia.
Well, don't leave Gaia out. I mean,
sorry, Gaia.
That's terrible.
Sorry, Mama. So, but now I lost my train of thought.
People who are really serious.
Oh, people who are really serious about
obviously people unlike us.
Deity work, and they really are researching the historical context of the deity, of the people who would have worshipped them or worked with them, because worshiping and working with the deity is really separate. They do not go hand in hand. You can worship a deity and not be working with them in a magical practice. But then you also have the other side of that coin where gods are like vending machines or Pokemon and or like your best bud who hangs out and watches you play
Call of Duty
and Fortnite on Saturday nights after you've had a shitty day at work. And it's just this really, really interesting concept that I'm finding with a lot of people where they're just like plug and playing deities. And it really confuses me because when I work with any spirit, I want to build a relationship with that spirit to have the best relationship possible within my means and within that spirit's means. And if I'm just calling Nyx if I need a good night-night and never doing anything else for Nyx, that seems very selfish.
Yeah.
And like circumstantial. And we all have that one friend who only calls you when they need you. They don't really ever check in. But then when you get that text from that friend who's like, hey, what are you doing? You're like, oh fuck, what's this bitch gonna have me do? What are they gonna ask me for? Where am I gonna be giving them a ride to now? And in this instance, if you're just flitting around to different deities because one's not working for you or you're not finding connection with them, you're the friend who's texting late at night.
Yes, you are the problem.
You're the problem.
Do you think that like the deity hopping thing could be a component of what we see in a lot of other things happening around people who kind of just in general just have like spiritual ADHD?
I would most definitely say that. I do believe that spiritual ADHD is most definitely a thing, because a lot
which is not to be confused with eclectic practice.
So with spiritual ADD or people who have that kind of approach to their practice, I find that it's because things aren't moving fast enough for them or they're not able to absorb all the information that they want to and see it implemented as quickly as possible. And with gods just in general, these are ancient spirits. These are spirits that have been around long before you were probably thought of.
Well, I would assume. So to add to that, though, to what you were just saying, though, because it occurs to me that we have one on the table at the moment, like a depiction, a statue of Horus. Mm-hmm. Horus as not only a Kemetic deity, but with the particular alignments and influences that are attributed to Horus. Horus actually, to me, would seem to be a deity that if you were to connect with him in any capacity, not just worshiping, but actually working with him, Horus would seem to me to be a deity that would be like, I want you to have structure.
Yes.
I want you to have order and balance, because those are very much components of Horus's thing. Where instead, if you look at, say, like goddesses like the Morrigan or Nyx, they're going to be like, you do whatever you want whenever you want, because that's how I live my life. Yeah. And you don't need to worry about structure. Like you do still need to kind of function in the context of devotional work with that goddess, with that deity, whomever they may be, and you're researching and you're doing what you can to make sure that what you're doing is actually in alignment with them, right? Like if you're working with the Morrigan and the first thing you do is get up in the morning and align your chakras, you're not fucking working with the Morrigan. So you still have to kind of have context and still kind of, follow somewhat of a line, but that line can kind of do this a little bit, right?
Yeah, most definitely.
Okay, all right.
But that's the interesting thing I'm finding about people and individuals and witches and pagans who are working with deities. I also find the pantheon mixing very interesting. Not that I'm opposed to that, but when I'm seeing people who are like attributing Hecate and then like Odin together, it's like,
yeah, and they really don't get along very well.
Like, have you done any research on Hecate? Hecate, is like, I don't need anyone, thank you. I'm just gonna be over here doing my thing. Yeah. Thank you for the candle and the garlic, though.
I should clarify, because I just said they don't get along very well, and I should say that has been, well, not just my experience, the experience of a few other experienced witches that I'm familiar with, but I've not found that Hecate and Odin really mesh well, particularly not in ritual.
Yeah, and that's not to say that you couldn't work with two separate deities from separate pantheons.
Oh yeah.
But you're not going to necessarily be calling in you're not going to be working with them and invoking them in the same time At least I wouldn't think so. I don't do that.
Well, that actually, maybe that's a good bridge to something that I also wanted to kind of talk about in the realm of actual deity work. Because we've talked about deities, right? The deity work. So you talk about, or we've talked a little bit about, like, you know, the cross pantheon kind of worship and these kinds of things, and, you know, and actually doing the work to establish what would be considered maybe a devotional or a working relationship with a deity. And it's always occurred to me when I've had conversations with people over the years who are like, well, I work with this god and 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 this god, you know, and I'm like, working with a lot of those deities, not all of them. Some of them that tend to be kind of a little looser in their, you know, like, you know, just based on who they are and what they're about, right? Some of them are kind of like, you know what, hey, you talk to me when you need to. I'm cool, whatever, right? But there are others, again, kind of making the example of, like, Kemetic gods, for one, right? Or Hecate, you know, where you've got these deities that are like, in establishing a working relationship with them, and in actually working more devotionally with these kinds of spirits, these kinds of deities, these gods, it's not that they necessarily claim you or own you, but you have to do your work.
Yeah.
And if you're focused on doing your work and building a relationship with this god, you really shouldn't have the time and the energy to then be also working on at the same capacity with, you know, 7 or 8 other gods.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like most people just don't, there's not enough time in the day, you know, not to mention the money that you would need for offerings for all of those different spirits, right? Or again, the time that you would need to be preparing and crafting offerings, you know, the time that you need to be researching and learning, conducting ritual, because ritual is, particularly in a devotional practice, ritual is a must. You must, you know, and you're not going to have the ability to do all of that. So in saying that, what's your take on that, I guess? Does it seem to me like, again, people, not only do they confuse the distinction or the difference between a working relationship and worship, but also, do you think a lot of these people maybe really, like, they're not really connected in the way that they think they are? Do you think that could be?
Yes, I think working with the deity in, like, a working relationship where you would be, because when you're working with a deity, the idea is that you are embodying those particular characteristics of that deity within yourself, in your craft, how you approach things in the world around you. You know, so just an example, if you are have a working relationship and have been building a working relationship with the Morrigan, and your initial response to any form of conflict is love and light, you're probably not. You might have tapped into maybe the archetype of the Morrigan at some point, but the Morrigan is not a love and light.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean,
and if you read any of her mythos,
if you're terrified of conflict,
Morrigan's not for
like,
you.
yeah, you probably want to find a different deity.
Yeah, well, if you're terrified of conflict,
or unless you're actually, or maybe you're working specifically, or you've chosen the Morrigan specifically to help you to grow through that, and to get to a point where you're like, I can be assertive,
yes,
you know, and beyond being assertive, I can even get aggressive if I need to, if it's for a good purpose and if it helps me to you know, communicate better, assert boundaries better, whatever. So, you know, that would be, I think, an ideal way to work with the Morrigan.
Yes. Whereas when you're worshiping a deity, it really does just kind of involve honoring them and what they look for, and giving honor to what they represent, what they quote unquote rule over, all those things. And so, you know, if you're just worshiping the Morrigan and you have an altar set up to her, and you're going about your life doing your best love and light thing, but you have an altar set up to her, and there's, you know, you've been giving offerings to her and stuff like that, and lighting candles to her, there's probably going to be a charge around there, because deities like attention.
Yeah.
That's just what it is. That's
Who doesn't like to be acknowledged?
Exactly. So there might be something there, but a working relationship involves, again, the embodiment of that deity and what they stand for within the world, like bringing that into the physical, mundane world. So, but I do think a lot of people really do get that confused, because if you're doing a spell that you found in I'm just looking at a book over here. Solitary Witch, Silver Ravenwolf. You're doing a spell from Big Red, and I think there might be a spell in there that evokes like Hestia,
like the gum
or something. Then, yes, Big Red like the gum. There might be a spell in there that evokes Hestia, and you've never worked with Hestia. You have no idea who Hestia is, other than the little bit of Hestia is the goddess of the hearth and home. And you're doing something like that. You might get a result, but the result's going to come from almost like an egregoric energy or an egregoric focus of the words that you're evoking.
So it's almost like a spiritual placebo. Or
yes.
Could it just be you?
It's
like, because I think sometimes
that
so one of my mentors years ago, particularly in chaos magic, someone that I was working with and talking to, said that when I'm about to get a little adult. So everybody, please ask your children to leave the room before this next piece. Okay, but there's this thing that comes up a lot in chaos magic, and it's something that a lot of chaos magicians get teased about by people who are not chaos magicians. But if you read the works of like old school chaos magicians like Austin Spar and things like that, a big component of a lot of people's chaos magic. I just want to qualify this right now. Like, this is not a big component of my chaos magic practice. But not that I don't think that masturbation is healthy. It is. But chaos magicians are known to basically to masturbate a lot as a component of their practice, because the process of doing that is something like, for one, you can do it all by yourself, right? So you don't need to worry about roping someone else into some sort of sex magic, right? Mm-hmm. But also that's kind of perceived in chaos magic to be kind of like a very primal way to raise power and to raise energy, mm-hmm. right? And to ultimately to direct energy, right? But anyway, getting back to what the point I was trying to make. So my mentor years ago, somebody I was talking to with chaos magic, said that what a lot of people don't realize that they're doing a lot in magical practice, whether they're chaos magicians or not, is they're basically just spiritually jerking off. And what he meant by that, in essence, is that sometimes you're not even really connecting to another spirit. Sometimes the spell you're working is absolutely bullshit, but because you believe and you've put the energy into it, you're going to get results. You're going to have a climax of some sort, right? And so I think about that sometimes, like with what you were just talking about with like the whole like spiritual placebo thing, like you could have absolutely like a really good result for a ritual or a spell, and you could be patting yourself on the back like, yeah, I really called that deity in, and yeah, they really heard me, and yeah, they helped me, and maybe all the power in that room was yours. Right? So, but that right there to me is an example of why it's, again, really important for people to establish beyond just the practice of witchcraft, to actually establish a personal relationship with the deity, mm-hmm. so that they know what that energy feels like when it comes into the room.
Yes, because there is most definitely a difference when Mama Luna Cheesewell decides that, for tonight's full moon, we're going to call in Hecate, and I've never really known her, and I've never really worked with her, and I don't really know her history, but she's a maiden mother crone goddess, so I'm going to evoke her.
I'm going to have to stab this woman.
And she does it, and she has an experience, and everyone else there has a shared experience of her experience, but then you come to, like, you go to, like, a Cindy Brannon ritual, that she's leading, and Cindy Brannon calls in Hecate, and it's like,
like, boom. Yes.
And you're like, oh, I'm going to shit my pants. Because there's a difference between I'm having an ecstatic practice and all this other, like, this is all like an ego thing, which, okay, fine. Ego's a good thing. Ego's good. It keeps us in check. Ego keeps us in check. Ego is what lets us know. I
think particular manifestations of ego behavior are good. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
But then you go and you actually have that experience with Hecate, where she comes into the room and you feel that energy manifest, and it's an external energy, not an internal energy. Mm-hmm. It's much, much, much different.
Yeah.
It feels entirely different than just Mama Luna Moon Will Cheese or whatever her name was. Yeah.
I don't know who this Luna...
I don't know who she is.
I don't know who this Luna Cheesewell person is, but I
But if someone's watching it and that's your name, sorry.
We're calling you out. What do you... what does in practice, right? What does it look like to actually go through the steps of establishing a devotional practice with a deity? Like you've learned, like you've figured out who they are. You've done some initial work to, to kind of like, they call it like the sniff test, right? Where you make a few offerings, you kind of make it clear to the deity, like, my interest is known. Who knows, maybe you're one of the lucky people out there who the deity's actually kind of poked you and has been like, hey, we have work to do, because that happens sometimes too, right? But even in that, you still have to give yourself a little bit of time to kind of figure out, like, okay, you might think we have work to do, but I'm not at a point in my life right now where I'm really ready maybe to make the sacrifices or to do the things that I need to do to really do the work. So can you hit me up next year? And you have, that's totally within your right as the human in that scenario to say, like no, I'm not interested. Not right now. Right. And it's good for you to do that, particularly if you really are not available, because if you try to bullshit him and you try to move into a practice that you're not really prepared for, you're going to have a bad time. But you've done all the preliminary shit, right? And now you're at a point where you're like, okay, like when I sit down at my altar or whatever, right, and I call this spirit in, I connect with this deity, I can actually, like, I can feel that. Like there's something real happening here, right? So what do the logistics, the physical practices around that look like? What are some things that people could do?
Well, you need to learn historical.
No, we've done that. We've done that. We've learned the history.
Historical rituals.
We've learned. Well, okay. Go on. Okay.
You need to learn some of the historical rituals and practices that would have been done for or around this deity. And maybe like historically correct offerings to do and petition this deity. You're not going to. I mean, Hecate doesn't really care. But, if you bring Hecate a pink sugar cookie as an offering, she's less likely going to accept that than if you bring her 3 bulbs of garlic. Because the garlic's a little bit more traditional. Garlic is known to be sacred to her, historically. And
she doesn't like sweets.
She's not. There are a lot of people out there who I've heard, like, giving her, like, Hershey's milk chocolate kisses. And I'm like...
Actually, this is reminding me of the story I share with about Alan and the offerings he leaves for her on the deep nun, and he's a Southern boy, and he always puts a honey bun, on the plate, and
it's honey,
and she likes the honey bun. She accepts that as a component of his offering, and he's connected with her. I have no doubt he's connected with her.
And the thing is like offerings can also become personal between you and your deity.
That's where I was going to go with that. Yeah,
I have never known Hecate to really like a red wine, though historically. That's a traditional offering for her. And so when I first gave her red wine, when I started working with her and building and fostering that connection, I got this like, no.
Yeah.
And I got like dark spiced rum. And I'm like, okay, cool, cracking. Well, then one day, I was enjoying a little glass of vino myself. And it was this like red wine that was cured in whiskey barrels. And
I remember that stuff. It was... go on.
You're not a wine person. You have no...
I like wine. I just didn't care for that wine.
It was delicious.
I like wine.
Shh. It was delicious.
Throw a glass of Chardonnay in your face.
I love Chardonnay. Is it the buttery kind?
It's super buttery.
Yes. Anyway, so I was having a glass of this wine, and I got like this pull to my altar and this feel of like, I would very much enjoy some of that.
Yes, I want some of that.
And I was like, you don't like wine. And I very much got this. I didn't say that I like it. I said I want it. So I was like, oh, okay. So I had half the bottle and she had the other half of the bottle. And,
well, I think that also brings us back to something we've talked about on the podcast before. And we talk about this a lot in classes when we talk about different deities and deity work, but it's not necessarily always the thing. It's the act of the sacrifice behind giving the thing, right? And in that situation, Hecate saw you and really enjoying this wine, and she's like, he's enjoying this wine. This is something that, but therefore has value. This would then by extension be a really good sacrifice or offering for me, because he's giving this to me. He can't have it, right? And it's not that she doesn't want you to have nice things. She does. Hecate wants you to have nice things.
I know she does. Thanks,
That's
Mom.
why. That's why I'm in your life. But
that's why I'm in your life.
Maybe. But anyway. but that's a good example, I think, of how to make offering. Are we okay? Oh, we're gonna have a fight on the way home. Oh God. I think it's good to mention at this point that in doing research that you have to make sure that you look being well, that too. I'm sorry, it's the Morgan. She's right here. She's just like
you're channeling your inner.
Just let him have it, Mike.
With all
just,
that Celtic blood you have.
Yeah, I'm gonna like strip down, titties out, and try to seduce Cuchulainn in any minute now. Anyway, I probably wouldn't do that. He's not my type. He's so white. Anyway, back on topic. So I think it's good just to say, it's good to mention, because this is a conversation I have with a lot of people that come into the store. You mentioned that it's so important to do some research into like the old rituals, you know, and admittedly a lot of the time that information is not readily available.
Or it's still reconstructualized.
Well, and we realize that Reconstructionism is just... That is just a component of contemporary witchcraft. Yes, we can't get away from it. It happens. And it has to happen because we don't live in the same world that our magical ancestors did. We don't. We have to switch shit up, right? It's not always a bad thing as long as we do it within reason and we still adhere to the roots of the practice, right? But what I was going to say is a lot of people get really frustrated because they're not able to find books on witchcraft that feature a lot of the times traditional, like old school, old world kinds of rituals. And in having that conversation with a lot of people over the years, I just, again, I want to restate that sometimes you have to look beyond the realm of witchcraft for these kinds of things. Like you may need to go and actually hit up your library or get online and do some research from reliable sources, get information from reliable sources. Okay. Vet your resources. Okay. But you may need to do some research on like the history of a particular country or area of the world. You might need to do some research anthropologically on the people of a particular culture or era historically. You know, even down to things like the industries and the crafts and the things that were affiliated with particular cultures. One of the reasons, and I think a lot of, this is going to sound like I'm crapping on Norse pagans, and I'm not, but a lot of people within the Norse pagan community fail to understand the depth and the meaning behind the weaving that shows up in a lot of the motifs around things, and because they haven't historically gone back and looked at how significant and important weaving and textiles and those things were to those cultures, right? Of course, that's going to be something that's incorporated into their spiritual practice, right? This was beauty, this was culture, this was your livelihood, right? The gods would hold value to this, right? And so, or give value to this. So I think it's important that you also look beyond the realm of strictly the pagan and the witchcraft community for information. You're going to have to.
You're going to have to go into historical contexts. You're just going to have to, especially when you're looking at deities and cultures that are considered ancient and historical, like ancient Greco-Roman history, ancient Egyptian history, all those things. There's a whole lot of information out there. There's documentaries. There's all this good, juicy information out there. And guess what? You could probably take an anthropology class. And an anthropology class is a good way to do it because you will have resources that you probably wouldn't be able to find unless you were directed there by someone who knew.
And get creative. Like go to your local historical museum, or like we have like the Museum of Natural History here, and you can go and you can like do like a pretend like you're digging up fossils and dinosaur bones thing there. Like you can go in and you can like you're excavating dinosaur bones, and you can go and do things like that, and you can figure out what kind of dinosaurs gods like Horus and Nyx rode on. Right?
Velociraptor.
Was it a velociraptor?
It's too small.
Oh, okay, possibly. I've heard debate on that. Like you see velociraptors in some things where they're only like 3 to 4 feet, and then you see others where they're like 7 to 8 feet, and so I'm never sure. Like, how big are they really?
That's a good question.
And do they have feathers? Because now we're finding that a lot of dinosaurs had feathers.
Well, we have fossil records of the feathers, so
yeah,
that's real.
It's fascinating. So you might want to do some research to figure out like what kind of dinosaur did your god ride on? Because they all did. They all rode on dinosaurs. That's why we feared them. What else might go into practice? I mean, when you've got the work, you've done the research, you've got a kind of a blueprint down for this is how I'm going to do my rituals, right? What else could that look like? Like, how would you say, just general deity work, not particular deity, but how would you actually structure a ritual offering?
Well, first off, you're going to need an altar to them, obviously.
An altar to them?
Yes.
Okay, so a dedicated altar. Would that be a good place to start?
Yes.
Like, I'm going to dedicate an altar to this god.
Yes, and don't muddy up that altar with other deities from different pantheons. Don't do it. And I'm not saying that you can't, but I'm saying if this is your first go-around, don't just throw all your deities on one little thing, because some deities really like their space. Hecate likes her space. Mm-hmm. Now, does my devotional altar have 2 different gods on it? Yes.
Hypocrite.
But they come from the same pantheon and are considered in connection to her via our tradition.
Fair.
So
you've dedicated an altar.
Yes, you need a devotional altar. That devotional and dedicated altar to that deity needs to be where you meet with them. It needs to be a specific place. And then in the process of doing ritual...
Okay, well, hold off, because we just threw an extra element in there. Because I think this is actually a good place to start. So establishing an altar space, like an actual physical, like a physical for you space where you can sit and meet and converse with your deity, right, is, I think, really important. And it doesn't need to be, I think it's probably good for us to kind of broaden the definition of altar here, because for many deities, particularly if you're looking at deities like Gaia, or we were talking about someone earlier who works with Dionysus, right? Like going out into your local forest, and finding maybe like a natural clearing, or who knows what it could be, right? Like a tree stump, who knows, right? Something like
big old stone.
That if that is a space that you can get to readily and you feel the right energy, and for you that is a very clear call to that deity, right? That can function perfectly well as an altar.
Yes, it can. But then that's also going to be like, if you're going out and doing that, you want to try and make sure that place, one, is kept up to standards of that deity. You want to make sure that you are protecting that space, you are respecting that space, and that's a sacred space for you now. Yeah. And so when you go there, like, you need to go there.
So that brings us to a good point. So preparation of altar. So you've so altars. Okay, so you're preparing an altar, right? Placement is important, right? And we were talking a moment ago, I made the example of being able to find a space outside, right? But but I think the majority of people are going to want to have something that would be, I think, much more domestic, right? Yes. Like something in the house, right? So, but I think, again, even then, you have to kind of be mindful of the logistics of that. Like, you probably don't want to set up an altar in the middle of your living room if you have small children.
Yeah.
Right? It may not be a good idea, particularly if you want to work with a deity that has stronger kinds of energies, somebody like the Morrigan, maybe even like someone within the spectrum, say like Loki, right? You probably don't want to put an altar to that deity in your bedroom, maybe, who knows, right? But I don't know. Say you're
having an altar to the Morrigan in your bedroom, since she is also a goddess of sex as well.
Okay, well, so maybe that was a bad example. But so for instance, say if you work very closely with the god Ares or Mars, probably, and you have it like you're in a relationship and you and your partner sleep in the same room in the same bed, probably don't want an altar to a god of war in your bedroom, right? It's kind of the idea.
I mean,
no, and that's okay. Anyway, so you've found the place.
Yes.
Okay, you've decided. Okay, this will be my deity altar.
Yes.
Okay, you need to clean.
Yes.
Altar. You need to name altar, and that should be a fairly ritualistic process.
Yes.
And there's no one way to do that. There are many ways, and the way that you determine for yourself is probably just as valid as any other. But you need to...
You want to name and or consecrate that altar in a way that is as close to traditionally done as possible for that deity.
If you have that information. That can be another reason why I think that trial period where you're getting to know the deity a bit more personally can be beneficial before you even get into any kind of practice.
Yes.
Short of maybe just making some simple offerings, right? That don't involve altar work, right? Because during that time, if you actually are establishing a connection with that deity also, that spirit, they could actually be pretty helpful in giving you information.
Yeah,
Like, like when you're like, I think I'd like to raise an altar to you, and if you've established a connection with them, they're going to probably give you some insight.
Yeah.
Right? They're going to be like, okay, like, lovely, I would be happy to have an altar. Could you please make sure the altar included this? And then that gives you something more to work with.
Yeah.
Right. If you don't have maybe, the structure of older examples of altars.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so you consecrate, or you name it through consecration. You've cleaned it. What might you place on said altar?
You want to place a representation of said deity.
Okay.
We have lovely statues, as you can see.
Does it need to be a statue?
It doesn't need to be a statue. As a matter of fact, a lot of the times, just using, again, Hecate as an example, when learning about her and researching about her, a lot of people say you need a statue, but also like a picture would work.
Yeah.
But you could also use things that would represent that deity. So, going back to the Morrigan, a sword, a shield, a raven statue, things like that. It doesn't need to be a statue.
Pumpkins.
Pumpkins would be Hecate.
The Morrigan? I thought there was a story about her in a pumpkin patch.
Acorn patch.
Acorn patch. Acorns don't grow on the ground. They grow in oak trees.
That's because the acorn patch is severed heads of her enemies.
So
it looks like an acorn with how.
Oh.
And
You heard it here, folks. If you want to work the Morrigan, you've got to go out and you've got to chop off a bunch of people's heads. We don't write the rules. For legal concerns, I'm just going to say right now, please don't go out and chop off.
Do not condone the violence.
Please don't go out and chop off anybody's heads.
Do not condone violence of any kind.
Okay. All right. So, okay. And then beyond that, then you would establish so, okay, moving back into the practice of deity work though. Okay. So what might that look like? I know an example you and I like to make a lot is, because we work very closely with Hecate, somewhat consistently, or I would say very consistently. We do things like we observe the deep dawn.
Yes.
Each month. Like, I think in the process of learning and researching your deity, you're going to find out that they have particular days of significance.
Yeah, particular days of significance, particular rituals or traditions that would be followed. For the Morrigan, there was always, you'd always do feast. You'd always have some sort of feast for her. Wine. For Hecate, deep dawn is a big thing. Deep dawn is a huge thing for Hecatean practitioners.
Well, it doesn't even need to be a day. I mean, you've got, say, if you were to work very closely with a deity that had a very strong solar alignment, you could really, any day of the week, you could go out midday when the sun was kind of at its zenith, its height, its acme, its tip, its high point in the sky. Sorry, my mind was wandering for a moment there.
About all those solar daddies.
There you go. But you could go out and you could make an offering, say during the daytime, while the sun was kind of in its height in the sky.
And you want to, with your deity, build a consistent practice around it, right? I mean, that's the big thing that a lot of people fail to do is, I did this offering once and now I'm not going to do it again for another 3 months. And they go back to their altar and they're like, why is it moldy? It's like, well, you left strawberries on your altar for 3 months. What did you expect?
So that's actually a really good point. So what would you have to say to our saltines about basically just kind of just the truth that you if you're going to do deity work and do it effectively, you cannot get lazy.
Yeah. You cannot and you should not get lazy. Now, when you've worked with a deity long enough, most of the time you'll develop a relationship of some kind, and some of them might be a little bit more lenient. Hecate, in the process of learning to work with her and learning who she is and some of her traditions, it's very in-depth, and there is lots of ritual that goes around it. But when you've done it for a few years, if you forget to change an offering on your altar, she's not going to bring down the wrath of Brimo upon you, but it's something that you do need to be consistent about, because if you forget about them, it's essentially like you've forgotten about a friend or a family member that was so close to you and helped you out. And so keeping it consistent is key. And I know there's going to be people out there who say, well, that's an ableist point of view, or, well, what about mental illness or ADHD? And all I can say is there's a point where you need to ensure that your practice fits in and is capable of being consistent with whatever you are capable of doing. I know that for me, I'm very, very busy. I have a lot of stuff to make. So usually Sundays are the day that I have the ability to kind of go through and refresh offerings, all that great stuff. And I try and do that as consistently as possible. But also, sometimes I just want a fucking day off, and that day off includes not doing something magical or spiritual, because
you do it professionally every other day.
Yeah, that's all you do. And so sometimes I'll go a Sunday or two, and they'll be like, why is my altar not clean? And I'm like, because I'm playing a video game. Shh. But when you say you're going to do something, you need to follow through with it. I will say that. Because if you go, oh, I'll clean your altar, and then you do it 3 months later, it's going to be a bad time. You're going to start to feel that disconnection between you and that spirit.
Yeah, you're gonna have made all that work to try to establish a relationship, and that deity's going to be like, I'm out.
Yeah.
Okay, bye. And that happens. Yeah.
That's why I love Hecate, because Hecate is super lenient.
I'm gonna sideline just a little bit on the kind of the topic of ableism, and I realize I'm going to sound ableist. But one of the things that we talked about earlier in this episode was, in doing effective deity work, a big component of that means that you are actively living your life day to day. You are trying to do what you can to step into kind of the dynamic energy, the persona, the values, in essence, of that deity, whichever deity it may be.
Yeah.
You know, and one of the best ways, one of the first ways you should do that, regardless of the god that you've chosen, is to do everything you can to take care of yourself.
Yes.
Okay, and that has nothing to do with how you look or how much you weigh or any of the other isms that come up in our very human culture and our very human values, right? But just in general, just doing what you can to take care of yourself. Mm-hmm. And so, having said that, okay, and just to clarify the point I'm trying to make now, okay, is yes, if there is something legitimately going on, if you are someone that is really struggling with something, you know, that really has just knocked you down, kicked your ass, right, whatever, then in that situation, trust that if you have established a meaningful relationship with a god, they're going to get it. Mm-hmm. They're going to be fine. They're not going to punish you for having a bad day, a bad week, a bad month, a bad year. They're not going to punish you for that, and they're not going to abandon you.
Yeah.
Okay. You might feel a little bit of distance there, but as soon as you get beyond that and you pick things back up in your practice, they're right there.
Yeah.
Okay, and they get it. They get it. Most of these spirits are way more patient with us than we give them credit for. Okay, so having said that, okay, yeah, there are definitely some that are not, absolutely. But having said that, what did Toth do to you?
Not looking at Toth.
Oh, okay. But the microphone. But
Robot penis.
yes, it's a black robot penis. But I also want to say that I've met with a number of people over the years who have come to me for mentoring, teaching, readings, whatever, right? Who really, at the end of all of the exchange and the end of the information and the end of the class, whatever it is, really what it basically just comes down to is they could be dealing with something like a legitimate something, right? Mm-hmm. But they also have become very defeatist and apathetic in their lives, particularly in the way that they handle their own health and sense of well-being. And when that happens, not that that doesn't happen to us all, trust me, God, I've had my moments where I've been like, I just cannot today, right? We're human, it happens. But that, to me, though, to be falling into a pattern like that consistently tells me that you're already really kind of failing not only your God, but yourself, because your first goal should be self-care.
Yes.
Right? And self-care, I understand the dynamics of depression. I understand the dynamics of neurospiciness. I get those things. But if you are someone who deals with chronic depression, if you're really legitimately doing effective self-care, that means you're taking care of your depression.
Yes.
And you can do that as a component of your work with deity.
Yes, most definitely.
Okay, so that's where I say I'm in danger, and I realize I'm sounding ableist with that. But all I'm going to say beyond that is, if you're not in a position to be able to do that, and that's totally okay. If you are just lost in the throes of whatever it is you're dealing with, and that right there is too much for you, like even that is hard. Don't try to get into deity work. Why put an additional responsibility on yourself if you're just not there?
Yeah.
Like, wait and do it later when you're in a better place.
Well,
That's all I wanted to say. Okay.
well, also you have to think about that. If you are unwilling to do what you can to take care of yourself, what makes this,
Even if that's the minimum.
even if that's the
Right?
minimum,
Like if you're dealing with chronic depression, even if all you can do is get up and like brush your teeth before you go back and crash and collapse back into bed, right? Each day, that's great. Do that. But as you do that, like, do it consciously. Like I went through some very simpler basic process of cleansing.
I mean, you don't want to. As someone who has sought out mentors, which essentially when you're doing
You
work
don't
with
know
a deity-
everything.
Well, when you're working with a deity, essentially what you're doing is you're seeking. It's almost like a mentorship of kinds, where you are stepping forward and asking that deity to come into your life because you want to embody what they represent, and in doing so, there are certain things you have to do. And as someone who has sought out mentorship from various individuals for whatever reason, whether that's a voice, whether that's, witchcraft, spirituality, whatever that is, I'm not going to go to the person who doesn't hex to learn how to hex. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go to the singer who doesn't know how to sing or doesn't sing to learn to sing. I'm just that's not how that works. So if you're going to Hecate, who is a goddess of not just sovereignty, but also a goddess of, the night and sorcery and necromancy, and your struggle with death, you have two options. Work through your issues with death however you need to, whether that's with a therapist or just, quite frankly, allowing yourself to work through it on your own, or don't work with her.
Or focus on another aspect.
If you're someone who abhors violence in any way, shape, or form, probably don't work with the Morrigan, or get into, or understand that sometimes fight is necessary.
Yeah.
Sometimes
maybe you're really into violence, and then you should work with the Morrigan or Chernabog. We were talking about Chernabog just yesterday.
Chernabog is terrifying.
I was like, yeah, no, that's a scary god. Those old Eastern European gods are terrifying.
Yeah, I just remember Night on Bald Mountain,
which was a very interesting depiction of Chernabog, actually. Anyway, that's okay. Bringing us back to deity work.
Yes.
I feel badly now. I feel like I was ableist. I think I was ableist, and I didn't really mean to be. But I think that is an important thing to consider. That's an honest conversation we need to have.
As someone who struggles with mental health and other various things, I don't feel you were ableist. I feel you were honest, and sometimes people just can't handle that.
Okay.
Sometimes people don't want to hear that.
Okay. All right. So I think I'm going to say for this episode we have pontificated on the paganistic priestly practices of deity work.
I agree. If you want more
Enough.
information, a really good book is Dedicant, Devotee, and Priest.
Yes.
By Stephanie Woodfield, who's written a lot of really good books, such as...
Here, I'll hold it up to the microphone for our listeners as well.
Such as Celtic Lore and Spellcraft of the Dark Goddess, which is a really good book if you are seeking to work with Morrigan. There's also another book she wrote called Dark Goddess. I didn't necessarily like that one, but a lot of people found value in it. So
Wait, Morgan Daimler is also a really good resource for the Morgan.
Oh,
Since
okay.
she threw that out. Daimler, Morgan Daimler.
Okay, cool.
Anyway, we have a listener question.
Sweet.
Okay. All right. So this question comes from a student in one of our classes right now, which I'm very excited about because people are engaging. It's a good thing. All right. So the context of the class basically is mediumship, and we've been talking a bit about how basically kind of what goes on with spirits after they depart life, right? After we kind of move beyond our mortal coil, what comes next. So they say, I grew up Mormon, which is a big problem here in Utah. So this is all new to them, this conversation about what continues on or how spirits continue on, and in essence really kind of still basically kind of live in the aftermath of death, right? Human death. Okay. But she asks what the reason is for spirits that maybe need to stay on Earth. We talked a lot about how we're surrounded by spirits all the time, right? And why that would maybe be the case. Why a lot of human spirits would maybe still be lingering or would be close to us, And not only staying around us, but like beyond that, but even actually finding like houses to inhabit, like hauntings, things like that, right? And so they clarify that they were under the impression that once spirits moved on, once we died, that they left Earth. Okay. And so in explaining this a bit more, and I already kind of had this conversation with her, and she's an amazing student. She's got really, really, really good natural ability. She's getting it. But I thought this was a good conversation to have. So the idea is that when spirits move on, when we die, we leave this life, we move on, that we don't really die. Like, it's not an ending. I think there's this idea religion teaches us that, like, we die and we either go down to a place of endless tormented fire, or we float up into the clouds and we put on our halos and we sit and we strum harps for eternity, right? Yeah. And that's really not true. That doesn't serve any soul, any spirit, human or living or dead. No one is benefiting from any soul going to heaven or hell, right? The purpose of what we need to do as living beings, as souls, is to continue to evolve and grow. And the way that we do that is basically to continue to experience life, even though it might be life that exists in a slightly different way, right? And so in talking with people in the class and in talking to our people who join us on tonight, our saltines here, is that it's better, I think, to think of something like death as really, in essence, kind of just a gateway into another life. But it is a life that exists in what would be a realm that would be, I think, slightly different to ours, or a realm that would slightly overlap ours in some sense, right? Yeah. This is a concept that we see coming up when we talk about things like the Fae folk, right? Where they live in their own realm, but their realm is a one that kind of overlaps ours in some sense, which is why we're able to have experience and connection, right? It works the same way with the spirits of the dead, right? They exist on a realm, they continue to live on in a different form, spiritually, on a realm that overlaps our own, which is why we're able to still maintain connection, right? So it is not to say that the spirits that are around us all the time are like necessarily standing in this room with us right now, but their energy, their presence, and their awareness could very much be here because they're existing in another realm that kind of overlaps this one. Yeah. Right? So, and we get into a lot of weird conversations around things like multidimensionality, these kinds of things when we get into these kinds of conversations, but I think there's some legitimacy to some of that. Right? I mean, we would have to be. We would have to be considering these things, right? So that's kind of a better way, I think, maybe to consider something like this. When you die, you're not going to float off or go somewhere else. Really, in essence, you just kind of move into a new life. And a life lived in a different realm, but a realm that is still very clearly connected to this one. Yeah. So, yeah.
I'd agree.
Be a demo better.
So, I do believe that's pretty much it for the podcast tonight. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and both on YouTube, watching us and listening to us. I am going to say that we are going to do some shameless promotion for the shop.
We have coming up here tomorrow night, actually, we have our divination study group, which is free to attend at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. That's Mountain Standard Time.
That is Wednesday, August 8th. On Friday, August 11th at 6 p.m., we have the Puppet Magic class, which is $25 a person. You do have to call to register. Wendy is teaching that class, and Wendy will be providing everything.
She provides everything you need to make a puppet. As we get to next week, next Monday the 14th, we've got the Dark Moon Goddess Rite coming up, which is a really cool way for you to actually kind of dip your toes into ritual work in the context of traditional witchcraft.
That is being not led by me this time, actually. It's being led by one of the dedicants of the coven, Ashley.
Ooh.
So come join us for that. It is $10 a person, suggested donation. However, I will say you will not be turned away if you cannot afford it. Okay, we want everyone to be able to experience it. It is at 8 p.m. Mountain Standard Time.
If you can't pay, you have to do some other sort of favor for Austin or I, and we'll just decide what that might be at the time.
No.
No? Oh, okay. All those horrible things I've done to those people.
And really, that's what we kind of have coming up in the next few days.
Just for the next week or so.
In the next week or so. If you have any questions, you know where to send it. saltywitchespodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact us via YouTube. You can contact us via Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and you can find all those things there. Again, like and subscribe with the button down below if you're listening on YouTube. And happy witching.